and get started. My name is Maggie Ray, and I will be co-hosting with our presenter. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the Beginning Gardener series, and this is our last segment of the Beginning Gardener series. Tonight's presentation will be on harvesting and produce storage. During this program, please stay muted the whole time and do not share video. As some of you have learned, if you do become unmuted or turn your video on, I do have that capability to turn it off. So if that happens, that's just me turning it off. As usual, if you have any questions for the presenter during the program, please type them into the chat box. If you have any technical questions or problems with your viewing or hearing of the program on Zoom, please put those in the chat box as well, or you can email me. All of that information is located at the top of the chat box right now. If you scroll up, it has a blurb that I put out. As usual, this program is being recorded, and whenever all these are uploaded to YouTube, I will be sending out a link to the entire list to our YouTube channel where you can view those. Our presenter tonight is Katie Bell. Katie is a University of Illinois Extension local foods and small farms educator in Southern Illinois. She covers Jackson, Franklin, Williamson, Randolph, and Perry County. And with that, I will let Katie take it away.
Hi, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to our last installment of the Beginning Gardener series. We're going to be talking about harvest and storage of a couple of different common garden crops that you might run into. So we'll just jump right into it, starting with maybe one of the most common things that people grow in home gardens would be tomatoes. So there are several different ways that you can harvest tomatoes. If you're wanting them to last on the counter longer, you might want to harvest them at what we refer to as at at any time after breaker stage, which I have a really good graphic here that I'll show you. Okay, so this is the breaker stage. So as you can see, there's just a little hint of pink around here, and you can harvest your tomatoes as early as this stage, and they will eventually will turn and ripen all the way to red. Although if you're just harvesting for yourself at home, you can certainly wait until they're almost ripe on the vine before you go ahead and pick them. So one thing that you want to do after you pick them, so you're just going to grip the tomato from the bottom and lightly give it a twist, and it should break off the stem right around here in this area, leaving this little green cap on here, which is called a calyx. And you'll want to go ahead and remove that as well. Usually you can just pop that off with your thumb. And you want to remove this because if you're bringing in more than one tomato, or you're putting more than one tomato in a box or a cart, they can bump up against each other, and this calyx will cause bruises or little punctures in your tomatoes, which will cause them to go bad faster. Something to think about when harvesting determinate tomatoes, they generally quit growing at around 3 to 4 feet tall, so they're going to be your shorter, more compact tomato plants. And they're typically going to be your just regular red slicing tomato. Those have a concentrated fruit set for about 2 to 3 weeks at a time, and they tend to have a really heavy fruit set all at one time. So if you're harvesting these or dealing with these, you're probably going to end up picking more at various stages of ripeness instead of waiting for all of them to come ripe, or harvesting them as they come ripe, because you'll be picking tomatoes potentially every day as that happens. Indeterminates tend to have a more spread out ripeness, and the plant also continues to grow and get bigger. So these tend to be your heirlooms, tend to be indeterminate, as well as most of your cherry tomatoes. And so these are kind of what you think of more for home gardening. They're going to have a more spread out fruit set and harvest, so you'll just get a few ripe at a time throughout the season. And so this would be a good thing to have on your patio or back porch if you just want to grab a few tomatoes at a time. One thing to keep in mind whenever you're harvesting tomatoes is that they bruise very easily, and so you want to be mindful of that. You don't want to drop them or bang them around too much. And the other thing to think about is if you are picking tomatoes very near that breaker stage, or even if you're picking green tomatoes to use as either in green tomato relish or fried green tomatoes, they can bruise too, even though they are not nearly as soft as ripe tomatoes. So as I'd shown this already once, so this would be your true green tomato. These are going to be very hard, and they can eventually ripen to red as well, but I don't recommend picking them at that stage. You want to wait until at least the breaker stage, if not the turning stage, to make sure that you get the most flavor that you can and the most ripeness that you can on the vine. So for storing tomatoes, you're going to want to store them stem side down. This kind of helps against bruise marks on the bottom of the tomato, and it also keeps them from rolling around in the container if you don't have the container full. And again, if you're using a container, you don't want to overpack them or stuff them in there very tightly, because again, I said they can bruise, and the bruising will cause them to go bad more quickly. So one way that you can store them is you can use an open container. So you're going to want to use an open container, a shallow open container, something like a shoebox or a Tupperware, something that is, oh, you don't want something that's sealed tightly, but you do want to keep them away from the light, and you want to try to store them at room temperature. So one good place to store them is that if you have a basement that is fairly climate controlled, and you can keep them there in the dark. If you've harvested a bunch at one time, you can store them in the basement. So fully ripe tomatoes will keep for a few days on the counter, especially if you keep them out of the light. And then, as I had said before, green tomatoes are harvested at tomatoes harvested at breaker stage, which is that slight pinkening or beyond. They will eventually ripen as well. So if you know that you are getting to the end of the season and you know that there's a frost coming and you want to go ahead and harvest your tomatoes, you can harvest everything off of that plant. And then I have heard some people say that they will wrap their green tomatoes in newspaper and then store them in a laundry basket, and that they ripen as they unwrap them and set them on the counter, that they will ripen. I have not personally tried that, but it's definitely something to think about. So you can harvest all of your tomatoes if you're worried about a frost, and then eat the most ripe first, and then wait for the rest to ripen on the counter. So these are just some examples of ways that you can store tomatoes. And as you can see, these are all stem side down. And as I said, that helps protect against some just bruising from just sitting on the bottom. And another thing to think about, you can see these are all, they're touching, but they're not jam-packed in here. And this keeps them from rolling around, but also they're not getting bruised from being pressed up too tightly against each other, because that will happen. And if you're storing a lot of tomatoes in an area that you're not around every day, so for example, the basement, you might want to dedicate a little bit of time every few weeks to go check on your tomatoes and make sure and remove any ones that have started to turn bad. So we're going to move on to cucumbers. Cucumber harvest can be a little bit more tricky because there are so many different varieties and shapes and lengths of cucumbers. It can really affect when you harvest them, because some cucumber varieties that are bred to be specifically pickling varieties, they maybe only get 4 or 5 inches long, where if you have really long English cucumbers, they may be 8 to 10 inches long and much skinnier than a pickling cucumber. So that's something to think about whenever you're selecting a variety and then thinking about harvest. You want to look at the harvest length recommendation on your seed packet, or you can look up the type of cucumber that you have. So typically we harvest these by length in accordance with what is recommended for that variety. Another thing that goes into that is also proportion. Cucumbers tend to get as long as they're supposed to be, faster than they get as big around as they're supposed to be. So it's just kind of developing an eye for it and looking and seeing. I've got some pictures here that to kind of help explain that. But whenever you're harvesting them, you want to use a sharp knife or pruners to cut them at the stem, and you want to leave a little bit of stem on the actual fruit so that that way you are not breaking the skin, because that will cause them to go bad faster. And as I said, you want to be careful not to break the skin or to bruise them. So you want to make sure that you avoid dropping them, especially the thin-skinned cucumbers. The skin can be damaged very easily, and then that allows for pathogens to get in there, and it can kind of speed up the breakdown process, and they'll go bad faster. Another thing to think about is that if you have long fingernails or anything that might catch, or rings that might catch or snag on them, that can also cause bruising or dents in them. So you may want to think about wearing gloves whenever you harvest. And another reason to wear gloves is that cucumber leaves and stems tend to be a little bit spiky or spiny. And if you have sensitive skin or you don't want to get those little spines in your hand, gloves are not a bad idea. So these are some different pictures. The picture down here in the bottom corner, this is what I would consider ideal harvest width and length for this particular type of cucumber. And it looks like it's probably a similar variety to this one here. And I would not harvest this one yet because of this tapering on the end. I would not consider that quite ripe, but given another day or two, then you could go ahead and harvest it. You don't want to let this happen. See how this one looks very almost watermelon in proportion to the length. For this particular variety, I would say that has sat on the vine too long, and I would also say that these are still definitely edible, but they may have gone a day or two long on the vine. And it also kind of plays into what your preference is. If they're close to being the right length and width, then you can definitely go ahead and harvest them whenever you feel ready. But these, in comparison, you can tell that these are much too small to be harvested at this time, and they should wait at least, I would say probably another week or two until they start looking closer to this one. But this one would be ready to harvest within the next day or two, because once it's warm and they're really growing, it doesn't take very long before just a matter of a day will determine whether or not they're ready to harvest. So for storing cucumbers, ideally the temperature to store them is about 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this is a little warmer than what you would store them in your refrigerator. But this is ideal temperature. They will keep for probably about a week and a half at this temperature and still be pretty good. So if you have a really cool basement room or somewhere that you can keep the temperature down to around that 50 to 54 degrees mark, they're going to keep the longest at that temperature, and you won't get any cold damage. One thing to remember with the thinner skinned cucumbers, so these tend not to have the spikes on them. They tend to need lots of moisture, or they start to shrivel up and get kind of some cold damage to them as well. So you want to try to store them in a plastic bag or some saran wrap, and that will help keep them nice and crisp. So you can store them in the refrigerator, and that's what most people do. And they'll last at least 2 days, probably 3 or 4 if they were fresh picked and then put into the refrigerator right away, especially if you keep them in the crisper drawer. But the temperature in your refrigerator is generally cold enough that more than 4 days, they start to get some cold damage, and they tend to get kind of rubbery. They don't retain their crispness. There's nothing wrong with them at this point. They're not bad, but they're not that nice, crisp, crunchy quality that we think of in a cucumber. So if you have lots of cucumbers coming all at once and you don't think you can eat all of them or give them away, you might want to consider pickling or canning. You can even make refrigerator pickles, which is a much less intense process than what you think of with your traditional canning or pickling that way. And so that's some ways to think about dealing with cucumbers. So for pepper harvesting, peppers are what I would say one of the trickiest things for me to harvest as far as determining ripeness, especially if you're trying to harvest green bell peppers. So I have a video here from one of my colleagues. Let's see if we can get it to play, because this does a really good job of explaining how to harvest bell peppers.
Hi, my name is Bronwyn Ailey. I'm a local foods and small farms educator for the University of Illinois Extension. I just want to give you a few pointers on trying to decide when your peppers are ready for harvest. Okay, so on bell peppers, we need to decide when they are mature. When we are picking colored peppers, we sometimes, if we're wanting to pick for a color, if our market is colored pepper, then we're going to want to wait until it starts to ripen and starts to show color. But once a pepper starts to show the color it's going to turn to, we can go ahead and harvest it. If we're picking green bell peppers, we want to pick when they are at maturity. And so there is a little bit of an art to deciding when the bell pepper is actually mature and ready. And you're just going to have to learn the feel of it. And it's not solely based on the size, because depending on the variety, the fruit can be range in size. So we're going to look at this smaller one, and as we feel it, we can feel that you can squeeze it a little bit. And if we look at the one right beside it, it is a little bit larger in size, and when I squeeze this one, it's a lot more firm. So we're wanting to harvest peppers that are very, very firm, and that's when we know that it has reached maturity. And on this variety, which looks like it's flavor burst, this is the color that we would be going for, so I would go ahead and harvest this pepper compared to this one. And also, if you'll notice how peppers, as they set their flowers, there's some more flowers sitting here, sometimes they'll set in a cluster. A lot of times they set in clusters, and so looking at the structure of the plant and where the flowers were at, you want to also be careful when you harvest, because this pepper was in the center of these three. The two on the sides are not ready yet, but the one in the middle was. And so you want to be really easy with the plant, reach in and kind of give the fruit a little bit of a twist when you pull it out, because we don't want to break the stem on those. And so you feel that pepper. I mean, yeah, okay. And then let's compare it to, I'm going to go ahead and harvest this one. Feel the difference. Yeah, you feel the difference. And then for more information on this or other topics, visit our local foods YouTube channel or contact your local extension office. Hi, my name is Bronwyn Ailey. I'm a local foods and small farms educator for the University of Illinois Extension. I just want to give you a few.
Okay, so I think that video is a really helpful one for trying to determine pepper ripeness, because there are several different ways that we can decide when we want to pick peppers. If you're harvesting green bell peppers and you want them to be at their maturest stage right before they start to turn color, because most green bell peppers will ripen to either red, yellow, or orange if you let them go all the way to color. But if you're planning on harvesting them as green peppers, then you're feeling for that very firmness. And it does take some practice and some comparison, because you'll get one and it feels ripe. It feels very firm to the touch. And then you'll find another one that feels even more firm. So just kind of comparing and practicing will help you decide when they're ready to harvest. Size typically does not have as big a bearing on ripeness as the firmness or the color does. So if you're harvesting some sort of colored pepper, so like snacking peppers, for example, we generally allow to go to color. It will be easiest to determine how to harvest those just based on the color that they are harvesting at. So if they're fully red, then generally they're ready to harvest. Or if you've got an orange variety of snacking peppers and you're looking for that orange color, you're going to let them go all the way to orange. So one thing to keep in mind, as was mentioned in the video, pepper plants are extremely fragile and they break easily. So you want to be really careful about harvesting them. And they tend to be brittle as well, so they don't have as much flex to them as a tomato plant does. Whenever you go to pull a tomato fruit off, there's some give to the plant, and then the stem snaps and it comes free. Whereas a pepper plant, sometimes you'll end up breaking off half the plant if you're not careful. So you can kind of help solve that problem by gripping the main stem of the plant and holding it just above where then you want to grip where you want to snap it off at, so that you can grab the pepper with the other hand and you're not pulling against the entire plant. So these are some different examples of peppers. On the left, these are jalapenos, and I just wanted to touch briefly on them. With jalapenos, they will also go all the way to red color, but we generally see them at this green stage, and you know that they are ripe whenever they tend not to have so much of the firmness to them as they get these little gray lines kind of, and if you feel them, it's a slight rough raised ridge, and that's usually whenever we aim to harvest jalapenos. They tend to be at their most mature stage before they turn red, and then they are also probably close to where they're going to be at their spiciest. So these are our green bell peppers, kind of at different stages of ripeness. So this would be a green bell pepper. We could probably go ahead and harvest it. This one is already starting to change color, so you could either let it stay on the plant until it turns all the way red, or you could harvest it now, and that there's usually not any issue with flavor. And these have gone fully red. The only reason that we would maybe harvest, the only drawback to letting them go to full red, because I know some people really like the colored bell peppers, for they're pleasing to the eye and they make really beautiful vegetable trays, but one drawback to them is that they don't last as long on the counter in the refrigerator as the green peppers do, because they are further along in their maturity. So like I said, green peppers will last longer than red, yellow, or orange peppers, because green peppers are basically just immature versions of red, yellow, or orange. You want to make sure that you keep them dry, that will prevent them from getting moldy or rotten. So you don't want to store them in a container or a place where they're going to have water getting on them. So you can store them on a counter for a few days as long as you intend to use them soon. And they will store fine. They won't get soft the way that a cucumber will or anything. But for a long-term storage, you want to put them in an airtight container in the refrigerator, or you can cut them up and freeze them. But you want to make sure that you're protecting them from moisture as best you can. So another common garden crop is potatoes. And so you can harvest those anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks after all of the top leaves have died back. So once your above ground leaves have laid down and died off, you can leave them into the ground for up to a month after that has happened, to allow the potatoes to harden off and develop a really tough skin, so that way they will last longer in storage. One reason you may not want to leave them in the ground for that long after the leaves have died back is because of rodent damage can be a problem. So if you have moles or voles that are going to dig in and take your potatoes before you get the chance to harvest them, you may want to harvest them before that. And then also, if you are in a particularly wet area, or you know that you're going to be getting a lot of rain soon, you want to remove the potatoes, because they will rot in the ground if there's excess moisture, or they may try to sprout. So you can use a potato fork or a shovel to dig the potatoes out of the ground. Or if you have a really large plot, you can also, they have tractor implements that are attached to the tractor to open the soil and make it easier to dig potatoes. But generally for your home garden scape, you're probably just going to be using a fork or a shovel. And you want to go in a few inches away from where you think the potatoes are at, and then you want to turn the soil or dig into the soil and open it up. But you want to be careful not to damage the potatoes as you go in, So you want to be mindful of where you think they are, or be a little bit cautious as you start to go in, and then once you kind of have a feel for where the potatoes are located, you can be a little bit more aggressive with your digging. So on the left, on my left, we have, this is a potato fork, so you just step it into the ground and you would use it to dig up under the potatoes and kind of bring them to the surface in the same way that this shovel is doing. And it's kind of just your preference as to and the tools that you have access to for what you want to use with digging potatoes. So these are just some potatoes that we'd harvested from a potato trial, and they're just being stored in these loose open crates for the time being. So whenever you store them, you again want to store them in a cool, well ventilated area, and you want it to be dark. So you can do this by putting them again in your basement, or a root cellar if you have one. You can store them in paper or mesh bags, cardboard boxes, or even baskets, anything that will help protect them from the light, because if they are exposed to light for too long, they will start to sprout, and then you can still use them or cook with them as long as they aren't mushy. So as long as they're even potatoes that you buy from the grocery store, you may notice that they have a few eyes. If you've left them out on the counter too long, they've got a few eyes coming on. You can generally just cut those off and use the rest of the potato as long as it seems to be in good condition. You don't want to wash the potatoes until they're ready to use, because this can add moisture to them, and that will again speed up that sprouting process. And it can also create a warm, moist environment for bacteria to grow, and it can speed up the breakdown process. So just like with the tomatoes, where you have them kind of stored in an out of sight area, you're going to want to inspect them every so often for soft spots and remove any that have bad spots. So you'll want to pull those out, and if they're usable, you go ahead and use them, or otherwise compost them, or throw them away. So if they're stored properly, they can last up to 4 to 6 months. There is a little bit of variation on this, both with storage conditions, and then also some varieties are bred to be more of a storage potato and last a lot longer than others. And that kind of varies from variety to variety. So if you're looking, whenever you're purchasing potatoes, that may be something that you take into consideration, how long you're planning on storing them, and how long you hope they will last. So sweet corn is another really popular one. It's generally ready for harvest about 20 days after the first silks appear. And another way to check this, you want it to be in the milk stage, which means that whenever you peel back the leaves on an ear and you poke it with your fingernail, you should get a milky substance that comes out. So if you get a watery substance, this means that they're not quite to the milk stage and you should wait a little bit longer. But if you don't get anything from them, then your corn has kind of over ripened. So you want to try to get them right at that milk stage, which is what gives us that really sweet characteristic flavor that sweet corn has. So you can always, if you think you're getting close to time, you can peel back the leaves on an ear or two just to check and see. And so to just harvest them, you're just going to grab the ear and twist it to remove it from the stalk. There's generally only going to be one ear per stalk. Some may have 2 ears. Generally, the second ear, the lower ear, is probably not going to be as large and may not mature quite as fast as the other one. So you want to be careful not to damage the stalk if you're trying to harvest the second ear in a few days. So storing sweet corn is pretty straightforward. You're just going to store it in the refrigerator for up to a week. You want to go ahead and leave the shuck on, so the leaves and the silks, you're going to go ahead and leave those on if you're storing them in the refrigerator. And then, of course, you'll remove the leaves and the silks and then wash them before you prepare them to eat. And if you are planning on keeping them for longer, sweet corn does really well as frozen. So you could freeze them on or off the ear. So you could freeze the entire ear, or you could cut the kernels off of the corn and then put it in Ziploc bags in the freezer. Before you do either one of these, especially freezing them on the ear, you're going to want to make sure that you remove the leaves and the stalks before freezing them, because if you freeze them just as they are, you will probably have a difficult time getting the silks and leaves removed after they've been frozen. So you want to go ahead and remove the leaves if you're going to freeze them. So another common thing that we grow in our garden that can be a little bit tricky to judge of when to harvest them are leafy greens. So that would be your head lettuce. This is just kind of a mixed bag of things. And if I don't talk about a specific green, it's generally the same concept for most of them. So head lettuce, you're going to harvest it whenever it's dense and heavy, depending on what variety of lettuce you have. That's going to kind of depend on what that looks like or feels like, but it will be you'll have a lot of compact, dense leaves, and you want them to be set very close together so it looks like a classic head of lettuce. And whenever that's really dense and heavy, another way that you can judge head lettuce is based on how wide it is, or the diameter. So if it's very large, then it's probably getting close to being ready to harvest. That will also depend on, again, the variety that you choose, because something like baby romaine is not going to be as large as your standard romaine lettuce, and so that will determine. So you kind of want to know what variety you have, so that way you don't harvest something prematurely, or that you don't leave something out too long. Kale and Swiss chard, I kind of lump these two together because they can be harvested similarly. If you plant them in a planter box close to your house, you can't harvest them a few leaves at a time. So you want to cut off the larger undamaged leaves. Generally, what we go for is with kale is about 6 inches long from the bottom of the leaf to the top, and I generally judge it by making kind of a Y between my pinky and my thumb and spreading that out. And that's a little less than 6 inches, but that's a decent space judge for me. And if you like the leaves to be smaller whenever you're using them for salads or putting them in smoothies, then you can absolutely harvest them at whatever stage you prefer to eat them at. You just want to make sure that you leave enough small leaves for the next harvest, so that way you can continually harvest from the same plants. If you are planning on doing something like a succession system and you just want to come in and cut the entire plant off and use those leaves and then replant another plant in its place, you can do that as well. But the method that I'm talking about would just be trimming the leaves off as they're ready to harvest, and this is a little bit more sustainable. You don't have to keep replanting the plants. You can use from the same plants. And then as you've harvested them and you have extra stems that are kind of getting in the way, eventually you will need to replant them if you want to keep harvesting. But this is a good kind of rule of thumb, is harvesting the larger leaves and then leaving smaller leaves to regenerate and regrow. Spinach is similar. You just want to cut the larger leaves off and then leave a few smaller ones to grow up in their place. Spinach tends to be different from kale and Swiss chard in the fact that kale and Swiss chard tend to stand up and their leaves grow a little further off the ground than spinach, where spinach tends to spread out and be lower to the ground for harvesting. So it can be a little bit different whenever you're judging the size of leaves. And again, spinach, you can harvest small leaves if you like baby spinach. It's just immature leaves of spinach. So again, it's a personal preference, and there really isn't a wrong way to harvest these loose leaf greens. For all of these, you want to use a clean, sharp pair of scissors or pruners. Especially with head lettuce, you want to be mindful of the fact that it's growing really close to the ground, and you don't want to dig your blade, whether it's your scissors or your pruners, into the dirt whenever you harvest it, because that can introduce some soil-borne contaminants and food contaminants that can make you ill or can also cause your produce to go bad more quickly. So that's something to be mindful of whenever you are harvesting. So you always want to use a clean pair of scissors or pruners. So these are, I think I've shown this picture before in kind of a different context, but these are some good examples. So this is baby romaine, and this is another type of lettuce behind it. I cannot remember the name of it, but it's a looser head lettuce, and it's a curly leafed lettuce. This purple one was a little bit difficult to judge on when it was ready because it laid out a little more loosely and a little more flat, and it was hard to tell. So you really had to kind of just feel it and feel the denseness and compared to the other. And that is a lot of what goes into harvesting these different crops is comparing one to the other out in the field, and it kind of helps you make that decision if you're having trouble deciding what's ripe and what isn't. And then this is kale. As you can see, it tends to stand up off the ground in a way that lettuce does not. And so you would just cut off these larger leaves and then leave, so you would cut these larger leaves here off and then leave these smaller, curlier, tighter leaves for later because they'll grow up and be replace the leaves that you removed. So as far as storing them, the best suggestion if you're going to be if you will be keeping them in the refrigerator, is you want to place them in a container or bag with a paper towel to help capture excess moisture. So you don't want to put them in a really tightly sealed container. You want to allow at least some of the moisture to escape because they can get soggy and tend to go bad faster. By the same token, you don't want to allow all of the moisture to escape either because then your leaves will dry out. So it's kind of a balancing act. A good place to store these, especially your heads of lettuce, would be in your crisper drawer in the refrigerator. So you want to remove any bad leaves right away and throw those out before you store everything. And then you can store them for up to 2 weeks, especially the kale and the spinach. They do really well in cold temperatures, so they will store pretty well in your refrigerator for a long time. The lettuce tends to be a little more tender and it will not last quite as long. So it probably can make the 2 weeks, but it might be a little iffy. And you might have to remove some bad leaves as you go along. So the last vegetable that I'm going to be talking about is asparagus harvest. Asparagus is something that we're harvesting right now in the early spring, where most of the rest of these crops are either summertime crops, or like the lettuce and greens, they're also a springtime crop. So asparagus, you're going to want to pick it whenever the spears are about 6 to 10 inches above the soil line, and you can allow that to be a little bit taller as long as they aren't starting to fern out. You want to catch them before that happens. So you can use a knife or you can harvest by hand. Using a knife, you're just going to cut them right at the soil line. The only drawback with this is that if you use a knife, you cannot tell quite as well where that woody end is, because as they come out of the ground, the part closest to the soil line tends to develop a woodier texture. And if you pick them by hand, they will bend and snap kind of at that natural tender give line, and so that will eliminate that woody end and you won't have that issue. So one thing you want to make sure of is that you do not over harvest your planting. So if your planting is fairly new, you may only be harvesting it for a few weeks, whereas an older planting, you can harvest it more and more. Over harvesting will weaken your crown, which will overall decrease the amount of harvest that you get throughout the life of your planting. So for asparagus storage, you're going to want to rubber band them and rubber band the spears into bunches. Generally, you will put them in about a 1 pound bundle. Especially if you're planning on selling them, 1 pound bundles are pretty common. So you're going to stand them in a glass or a cup with a few inches of water in the bottom to allow to keep the asparagus nice and crisp and upright and kind of maintain that turgor pressure. So again, you'll be storing them in the refrigerator, and you can store them for up to a week and maybe even longer. They just tend to lose some of their crispness. One thing you'll want to keep an eye on, if you're storing them for that week mark or longer, you're going to want to make sure that you're keeping your water clean. So you might have to change it out a time or two, similar to the way you would if you were keeping flowers. So on the left, we have a picture of asparagus and the way that it should be stored. And this is a bundle of freshly harvested asparagus. So you can see this one right here in the front is just barely starting to get a little bit of a head on it. So that one could have been harvested a little bit earlier because it's starting to get a little bit of a flower or a fern to it. And so we don't quite want that. And this is asparagus as it's growing out in the field. You can see that we have several spears here that could be harvested. This one looks like it's probably tall enough, and this one back here as well. As you can see, we have some, it's a little bit difficult to see in the picture, but this is a spear that's not quite ready yet, but it will get taller. One thing that I didn't quite realize whenever I was first learning how to harvest asparagus was that you can have really, really thin spears like this, and you still want to go ahead and harvest them because waiting around, they won't get any bigger around. They pretty much are as big around as they will be. So don't let that hold you back or slow you down whenever you're picking them. It's really about the height or the length. So general storage tips overall. For your fresh produce, if you are wanting to try to extend it throughout the season or into the winter months, you can do this by freezing, canning, maybe try vacuum sealing a lot of these products. I know that raw potatoes do not do well frozen. If you want to freeze potatoes or store potatoes in a frozen form, you're going to want to cook them first and maybe make mashed potatoes out of them before you freeze them, but do not freeze them raw because that there's a conversion of the starches and sugars in the potatoes in it and gives them a bad texture, and they are not good to eat if you try to freeze them raw. As most of you probably know, tomatoes, they're best kept on the counter at room temperature. They tend to lose their flavor if they're put in the refrigerator, and they also can kind of take on this gritty texture if they're kept in the refrigerator as a whole tomato. So if you're looking to store tomatoes longer, you can think about canning them or maybe turning them into soups and sauces. That can extend the life of some of your fresh produce. And for all of these, you don't want to wash the produce until you're ready to use it or to preserve it, because this will break that natural barrier that fruit has, that produce has, to keep out bacteria. So if you wash it, you should go ahead and eat it as soon as possible, or plan to preserve it. So I would recommend that anything that you're planning on processing for preserving, you should treat it like you're going to eat it. So you should go ahead and wash it and make sure that it's clean and ready to eat whenever you bring it out of the freezer or you open that can up. So are there any questions?
Yes, we have quite a few questions. Really fast before I start from the top, someone had asked if you had any, this would just go along, squash, like a summer squash storage, I think is what they had said. Sorry, there's been a lot of questions. Tips.
So summer squash, I'm thinking something like zucchini or any of your summer squashes. Those can all be stored on the counter as well, or kind of in your cool dark space. They don't need to be refrigerated. They will last on the counter, especially things like spaghetti squash or acorn squash. Those will all last on the counter. Zucchini you could refrigerate, but that would be
okay. Hold on one second. I got a little out of order here. Let me see if I can put myself back where I was at. Okay. All right. So from the beginning, we did have a question about jalapenos. Do you harvest jalapeno peppers when part of it starts to turn dark?
So
That dark green.
the dark green. So with the jalapenos, let me go back to my picture because I'll be able to. With jalapenos, the way that I have learned to harvest them is so they're fully dark green, and then they are starting to get these little bumps on them, these little ridges, these little gray marks, and that will also have a texture to it when you run your hand over them. So you can harvest them whenever they start to turn dark green, but I would wait until they get this texture to them. That is whenever they are um, the are ripest, and they will have your most flavor, and they'll be at their spiciest point.
Okay. Someone commented, and they were talking about sun scald. Their peppers always get sunburnt before they turn colors, and so they can't harvest them. They want to know how you can prevent that.
So that is one issue with peppers, especially trying to get a good canopy on your, so trying to promote your foliage to grow early in the season will help with sun scald. If you're keeping them in a tunnel or protected culture, so if you're using a high tunnel, a shade cloth can help. But that is another reason that people tend to harvest peppers green is because of sun scald being an issue. So I don't really have a good suggestion other than trying to promote the leafy canopy of your peppers. So if you can get good foliage on them, that will help protect the fruit from getting sunburn.
Yeah. Having that good disease and pest control throughout the season will help from your plants defoliating as well. I know defoliation was in that one video you showed. I was actually in it.
Yeah.
And that was a problem we had in some of those plants was the defoliation from fungus that caused a lot of sun scald in that trial.
So yeah, so that can definitely be something else to consider. That's a really good point. Thank you, Maggie.
Yeah. When my potato leaves turn brown, I've had the trouble with the potatoes turning soft. Should I harvest after the leaves are just starting to turn?
I believe that you can. I know that some people will, as the leaves start to turn, they'll go ahead and just mow their planting down and then go in and harvest. The only issue might be that your potatoes might be a little bit small. Another thing with the softening, you want to make sure that after they start to die back, you're withholding water. You don't want to keep watering the plants or the bed because you want it to be nice and dry. That helps kind of with harvesting, and then it can also help to keep them from going bad in the ground.
Okay. This is another potato question. If you harvest the potatoes before the tops of the leaves die, will the plant continue to produce more? I don't know if they're talking about in ground or maybe in one of those like potato bins.
Yeah.
But
In ground, it would be a little tricky to do that without destroying the whole plant, just because you're uprooting it and you're taking you're messing with its root system, so you're disturbing it enough that you might end up killing it on accident if you harvest the potatoes from it. In a potato box where you can kind of get at the lowest growing ones, that's kind of the way they're designed, is to keep harvesting while the plant is growing. And another thing with, especially with in ground, with harvesting them before the leaves start to die back, your potatoes are probably not going to be as big as they would be if you left them. But that's definitely something that you could kind of experiment with in maybe a corner of your garden.
okay. Another potato question. Potatoes that skin turns to a green hue due to sunlight, is it a myth that they're poisonous?
So that well, I know that don't eat green parts of potatoes. They can be they can make you sick, but you would have to eat a lot. You'd have to sit down and eat like all green potatoes. the whole time. You'd have to make a meal out of them. So generally, if you just cut it out, then you're fine. But you kind of want to avoid eating that because that's not good for you.
Okay. And after I saw that question, I did look it up on the USDA website because I was like, I've always been curious of that. And it did say the same thing. It said you could peel it off or,
Yeah.
I would say you have to eat a lot. So, yeah.
And I can't remember if it's arsenic or cyanide.
It says it's something I cannot pronounce or find at the moment.
But I know it's one of them, and they produce it, and so the same thing with potato leaves. The only part of a potato plant that is edible is the potato itself, for the same reason.
Yep. Okay, now we're on to sweet corn. Can sweet corn be planted closer together to achieve a better fertilization in a home garden opposed to the recommended distance between plants?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure. I know if you're talking about fertilization, if you're planting them really close together, you're probably going to have to fertilize them more than what the recommendation would be for the normal spacing, because you're going to have twice as many plants, for example, in the same space, and so each plant's going to need nutrients, and so you would have to give them more nutrients to kind of make up for that competition that they're in. So I don't know if planting them closer together would help with a fertility issue. It could help with some lodging issues. If they're planting closer together, they might be able to lean on each other, but I'm not exactly sure about that.
Yeah, we can look into that. If that person who asked that question wants to email me, we can look more into that for you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is a question about rhubarb. How late in the season can you continue to harvest rhubarb? I didn't know anything about rhubarb.
I don't know anything about rhubarb. I did see a mention of rhubarb in my research, but I don't know. So I am more than happy to do a little bit more digging and find out for you. Again, so if you want to contact Maggie, we can get back in touch with you on that. But I don't know about rhubarb.
Yep. Okay, so now we're on to, they had a question about growing cucumbers and squash and using a trellis. Is there a recommended size of an opening for trellis material? Any issue if using a small opening size, will the weight of the hanging vegetables damage them?
Okay, so depending on what you're using to trellis, so my experience with trellising cucumbers is growing them again in a high tunnel, and so they grow in. Let me see if I can find my picture. So they're growing. It's not exactly in the same weave system, but it's a single string, and we train the plants up it and hold them with clips. So when you're doing that, you're removing a lot of the foliage, so there's not as much weight. If you're using a trellis system, something like a pallet or a lattice work, the only issue that I see with the opening sizes being a problem is that if the cucumber bud or the cucumber flower, so like this is a baby cucumber right here, if this grows into an opening or a hole, and then it matures in there, it's probably going to be damaged or pinched by the lattice holes. So that's something to consider, is that if you're growing cucumbers and there's small openings, there's going to be a few of them that might get damaged by being pressed against the sides of the lattice work or the trellis.
Yep, we did the same trellising in our high tunnel, as you know, and those little ones, if they somehow grew into a clip, it would try to grow around the clip and it would be damaged, and then you'd also damage your clip, and you don't want to do any of that. So yeah, just going through and moving those out if they get caught before they start growing. That's good. Oh, and there was a question about asparagus harvest that I did miss because I kind of answered it, but how much is too much over harvesting for asparagus? And I had said that it's really when you stop harvesting is over harvest. Like you don't want to harvest too long because it needs to build up all that energy to produce the crop the next. So you need to grow all summer.
Yeah.
There is a
So
rule, and I just can't quite remember it.
yeah, I had seen somewhere for like a mature crown, it was like does 6 to 8 weeks sound right, and then you should quit.
Yeah. It does. It's something about after it's grown for its 3 years and you can harvest it finally. It's 2 weeks and then another week added on every year after that till you get to 5 or 6 years, and then you can do that full 6 to 8 week
6 to 8.
harvest.
Okay.
I believe that's what it is.
Yeah.
So yeah. So okay, let me.
I think so I think that pretty well answers it. We can always look into it a little bit more and contact them if we need to.
Yeah, and there are videos on asparagus on our extension
Yeah.
our YouTube page as well, and you can get a hold of one of us for that.
Mhm.
Oh, and this was another. I think it was towards asparagus about canning or freezing. And just in case they didn't catch that, I did answer that. They're talking about flavor. I believe that is just a preference.
Yeah, I
Whether
think.
you like the way it tastes or not.
Yeah, I think the only other thing to me too is the texture, because once you freeze it or can it, it's not the same like tender. It's a totally different texture.
Yes. Okay, let me see. When to harvest snap green beans?
Ooh. So with green beans, you want to, again, it's kind of just a feel thing. You don't want to let them sit too long on the vine or on the stem, because they'll start to get they'll get too large, and the bean inside will get too big and get tough. So you want the pod to still be smooth when you harvest it, but you don't want it to be flat or too small. So it's kind of a size thing and a preference thing as well, and then that can also be determined by the variety.
Okay. And we did have someone come back and say on the corn question, they were actually meant pollinating the plants and not fertilizing. They meant planting closer together to get better pollination in there. So, but we can still look that up if you want to email us.
Yeah.
More corn questions. So someone is stating that their cucumbers get powdery mildew every year. And they said, did you say you remove the leaves of your cucumber on the vine, or will they die off? And she said or I can't tell who that is. They seem to die too early in the season, and I don't get too many.
Okay. So there are a couple things that you can do about that. So with powdery mildew, if you can try to get some more spacing between your plants, because that will help with airflow. Train them to some sort of trellis system, whether it's getting them to climb a homemade trellis or a pallet or something, or even using the string trellising system, and that will help get the air moving through them. You can also, like I said, prune off some of the lower leaves. Generally, after trying to remember how many times we harvested them before we started pruning the leaves, but then you prune a few leaves off at a time. If you prune off too many leaves, you can kind of shock the plants, and then they won't produce for a little while, and then they'll start producing again. You still will eventually get powdery mildew, but that can slow it down if you're not willing to spray for it. Another thing that you can do is try to look for some of your more hybrid or resistant varieties, and that will definitely help.
Okay. Last question we have is, if your onions bolt, can you still eat the bulb?
Yes. Sorry, I was letting my dog back in. He's been on an adventure. Yes. So you can, if they bulb. Are you talking about green?
Or bolt, if they bolt.
Bolt.
Yeah. Sorry.
I am not exactly sure on that. I would think that it would still be. It might just be a flavor thing. I know, like lettuce bolting, for example, it's not very appetizing. The leaves tend to get kind of off flavored, and they're tough, and then they can be bitter. As far as onions go, I don't think it wouldn't be unsafe to eat. It just may be a personal preference on a flavor.
All right. Yep. And for people that don't, when a plant starts to bolt, it's stopped putting all of its its energy into producing that fruit or bulb or leaf or whatever. And now it's like, I'm going to produce flower, seed for the next generation. So that's why everything gets so not good tasting.
Yeah.
For that. But that is the last question we had. If anyone has any more questions, please be sure to email them to me and we will get them answered. If anyone does need any slides from anything we've seen, just get a hold of me. We can probably hook you up with those. And then once again, all these videos are going to be put on our YouTube page, which right after this presentation, if you go to your inbox, I have emailed out an evaluation for this, and it also has our YouTube thing in there. It also has a link to that video. For me, it wasn't coming through very well, so if you want to rewatch that pepper harvesting video, you can. Thank you everybody for attending these sessions. For people that have just made it to a few, or whoever made it to all 6, we really appreciate it, and we appreciate the feedback on these because we want to know what you want to learn. So thank you and have a good night.